mother answered the door on a Wednesday morning in a small floral bathrobe she had owned since 1998. I had not been at her house in 11 years. She had not been expecting me. She had been holding a small white mug of coffee. She had opened the door about 6 inches. She had looked at me. She had looked at the two people standing behind me. She had said, in the careful voice she had been using on me my whole life, "Sawersi, why are you here? Who are these people?" I had told her she could let us in, or we could conduct the conversation on the front porch. I had told her the conversation was going to happen either way. I had told her she had 30 seconds to decide. She had opened the door. She had stepped back. The three of us had walked into the small entryway. My mother had looked at the two people behind me. The two people had been civil deputies from our county sheriff's department, in their dark navy uniforms, with their identification badges visible on lanyards around their necks. They had been there to serve documents. They had not been there to arrest anybody. They had been there because the documents I had been carrying were the kind of documents that required formal service by a court officer in order to be legally effective. My father had walked out of the kitchen at that moment. He had been wearing a small flannel shirt and the small reading glasses he had been wearing since I had been a child. He had been holding a small piece of toast. He had stopped in the kitchen doorway. He had looked at me. He had looked at the deputies. He had said, in a voice that had been smaller than the voice he had been about to use when he had walked into the entryway, "Sawersi." I had handed my mother the folder of documents I had been carrying. I had told her, in the small, clear voice I had been preparing for the previous 9 months, that the folder contained a civil complaint and a summons. I had told her that she and my father had been named as defendants in a lawsuit I had filed against them in our county civil court 2 weeks earlier. I had told her that the lawsuit was for the recovery of approximately $147,000 in child support payments that had been intended for me and my son between 2010 and 2022, and that had been deposited into bank accounts they had controlled, and that had never been transferred to me. I had told her that the deputies were there to confirm service of the documents and to file the small affidavit that would establish that she and my father had been formally notified of the lawsuit on this date and at this time. I had told her she had 28 days to respond through her attorney. I had told her, if she did not have an attorney, that she should retain one promptly. My mother's mouth had fallen open. She had not made a sound. The small white mug had been still in her hand. The coffee had been sloshing slightly because her hand had begun to tremble. I want to tell you what happened in our family from the time I had been 17, when my son Caelan had been born, until the morning I had been standing in my mother's entryway with the deputies. I want to tell you because there are people listening to this who have been telling themselves, for years, that the people in their family who had been taking from them had been doing so out of necessity, or out of love, or out of some other small understandable reason that would explain why the taking had been allowed to continue. I want to tell you what I figured out about my own family, and about what the taking had actually been, and about what I had finally decided to do with the figuring out. Before I do, hit subscribe, and tell me one thing in the comments. Tell me about a time you eventually figured out that money you had assumed was being held for you by a family member had been taken from you instead. Tell me how long it took you to figure it out. I read every comment. Now let me back up to the year I was 16, because the year is when the taking had started. My name is Sawersi Brennan. I am 35 years old. I am a senior construction project manager at a small commercial general contracting firm in Indianapolis. I have been in this role for the previous 5 years. I have been in the construction industry for the previous 12 years. My job involves the small, careful coordination of large construction projects, in which I am responsible for budgets, schedules, subcontractors, regulatory compliance, and the small daily problem solving that keeps a project moving forward through the inevitable difficulties of building something at scale. The work has been good to me. The work has been the foundation of the life I have been building since I had been 23 and had finally been able to start building anything at all. I want to tell you about my son, Caelan, because the son is the reason the rest of the story matters. Caelan was born when I had been 17. The pregnancy had been the result of a small relationship I had been in for about a year with a boy named Devlin, who had been 18 at the time and who had been a year ahead of me in high school. Devlin had been the kind of teenage boyfriend who had been better than my parents had given him credit for being. Devlin had been from a working-class family in our town. Devlin had been planning to go into the trades after high school. Devlin had not been the kind of teenage boy who would walk away from a pregnancy. Devlin had not walked away. Devlin had been there during the pregnancy. Devlin had been at the hospital when Caelan had been born. Devlin had been honest about his limited financial capacity at 18 but he had also been clear about his intention to be a real father to our son. Devlin had agreed, before Caelan had even been born, to be on the birth certificate. Devlin had agreed to begin paying formal child support as soon as he had been earning enough to do so. My parents had not approved of Devlin. My parents had not approved of the pregnancy. My parents had, in the small, careful way some parents do when their teenage daughter becomes pregnant, decided that the pregnancy had been a kind of family crisis that would be best managed through the consolidation of all decision-making in my parents' hands. I had been 17, I had been a junior in high school, I had been living in my parents' house, I had been by every legal and practical measure a dependent minor. I had not had a strong basis for resisting whatever decisions my parents had wanted to make. My parents had made the following decisions. They had told me, when I had been about 6 months pregnant, that they would be taking legal guardianship of my son once he had been born. They had explained that this had been the simplest way to handle the practical details of raising a baby while I had been finishing high school. They had told me that the guardianship would be temporary. They had told me that I would still be Caelan's mother in every meaningful sense. They had told me that the guardianship was just a small administrative arrangement. I had not understood what guardianship had meant at 17. I had not had a lawyer of my own. My parents had retained a lawyer who had drawn up the documents. The lawyer had explained the documents to me in a small meeting in his office. I had signed them. I had been 17 and a half. I had been about to give birth. I had not had the framework to push back. The guardianship had given my parents legal authority over Caelan. The guardianship had also, in a small specific way that I had not fully understood until much later, given my parents the authority to receive any payments that had been made on Caelan's behalf, including child support payments from Devlin. Devlin had begun paying child support when Caelan had been about 4 months old. Devlin had been 19 at the time. Devlin had been working as an apprentice electrician. Devlin's initial child support payments had been small. The payments had been about $300 a month at the beginning. The payments had grown as Devlin's career had grown. By the time Devlin had been 22, he had been a journeyman electrician, and his payments had been about $700 a month. By the time Devlin had been 28, he had been a master electrician and had been running his own small electrical contracting business, and his payments had been about $1,300 a month, adjusted upward by the court as his income had grown. Devlin had paid every month. Devlin had been the kind of father who had taken his child support obligations seriously. Devlin had never missed a payment. Devlin had also been actively present in Caelan's life throughout this entire period, in the small specific ways an outside parent could be present despite my parents' legal guardianship. Devlin had taken Caelan on weekends. Devlin had been at Caelan's school events. Devlin had been a real father. What I had not known for 12 years was that not a single dollar of Devlin's child support payments had ever been used for me or for Caelan in any meaningful way that I could have benefited from. The payments had been deposited into a bank account that my parents had controlled. The account had been in my mother's name as the legal guardian of Caelan. The payments had been spent by my parents on whatever they had been wanting to spend money on. The payments had not been deposited into a savings account for Caelan. The payments had not been used to fund Caelan's small daily expenses, which had been minimal because my parents had been claiming Caelan as a dependent on their taxes and had been receiving the associated tax benefits. The payments had not been transferred to me at any point during the 12 years. The payments had been, by the simplest accurate description, stolen. I want to tell you what had happened to me during those 12 years, because the happening had been the small clarifying counterpoint to what my parents had been doing with the money. I had finished high school at 18. I had not been able to attend a 4-year college. I had not had the financial support from my parents that the family had been telling extended relatives I had been receiving. I had enrolled in a small community college in our town. I had taken classes part-time while working 2 jobs. When I had been 19, my parents had told me that they had been needing me to move out of the house. They had told me that they had been wanting to focus on raising Caelan in a stable environment. They had told me that my continued presence in the house had been disruptive to Caelan's small daily routines. They had told me that I should be grateful that they had been willing to raise my son for me. I had moved out at 19. I had not had anywhere to go. I had slept in my car for almost 2 months while I had been working at a small diner in town and at a small retail store at the mall. I had eventually been able to rent small room from a colleague of mine at the diner who had been a single mother named Caelan, and who had been kind enough to let me stay in her small basement for $100 a month. I had visited Caelan at my parents' house on the weekends. I had been allowed by my parents to see him for short visits. The visits had been supervised. The supervising had not been a legal requirement. The supervising had been a small, specific way my parents had been demonstrating, to me and to Caelan, who had been in charge of the situation. I had not been Caelan's mother in any way that had been visible to him. I had been a kind of recurring older sister figure who came over on Sunday afternoons to play with him for a few hours before leaving. Caelan had not called me Mom. Caelan had called my mother Mom. Caelan had called me by my first name. The not calling me Mom had been the small specific arrangement my parents had been organizing, without ever discussing it with me directly. I had been homeless, or marginally housed, from the time I had been 19 to the time I had been 23. I had been working. I had been taking classes when I could afford to. I had been saving small amounts when I could. I had been, by every visible measure, the kind of young single mother who was failing to get her life together. The visible measure had been controlled by my parents' framing of the situation. The actual reality had been that I had been working 2 and 3 jobs while sleeping in basements and on couches, and that the money that had been intended to help me and Caelan had been sitting in a bank account my parents had been spending on themselves. I had eventually, at 23, gotten a small administrative job at a small commercial construction firm. The job had been entry-level. The job had been my first real chance at a career. I had taken the job seriously. I had been promoted 3 times in the first 4 years. I had been moved into project coordination at 27. I had been moved into project management at 29. I had been moved into senior project management at 30. I had been making $120,000 a year by the time I had been 33. I had been making $146,000 by 35. I had been rebuilding my relationship with Caelan throughout this period. The rebuilding had been hard. Caelan had been raised for the first decade of his life with the understanding that I had been the unreliable older sister who had given birth to him. The rebuilding had required me to be patient. The rebuilding had required me to be present. The rebuilding had required me to earn the small daily trust that I had been denied the chance to earn during the years I had been homeless. Caelan was 18 now. Caelan had been living with me for the previous 2 years, since he had been 16, after a small specific incident at my parents' house in which my father had been verbally cruel to him in a way that had finally been visible to Caelan as the kind of cruelty that had been visible to me my whole life. Caelan had asked me after that incident if he could come live with me. I had said yes. We had been figuring out the small daily logistics of being a parent and a teenage son to each other after 16 years of having been kept apart. We had been doing all right. We had been better than all right. Devlin had been a steady presence throughout. Devlin had married a woman named Sarade when Caelan had been 10, and the 2 of them had a small daughter together. Caelan had a good relationship with all of them. Devlin had been continuing to pay child support up until Caelan had turned 18. I want to tell you how I had figured out what my parents had been doing with the child support, because the figuring out had been the small specific moment that had eventually led to the morning in my mother's entryway. I had figured it out about 2 years ago. Caelan had been 16 at the time. He had recently moved in with me. We had been at my small kitchen table on a Saturday morning. He had been telling me about a small conversation he had been having with Devlin the previous evening, in which Devlin had been explaining in age-appropriate terms the structure of the child support arrangement that had been in place for 16 years. Devlin had been making sure Caelan had understood that Devlin had been financially contributing to his upbringing throughout his entire life, even though Devlin had not been the parent of record. I had been listening. I had been processing. I had then asked Caelan whether Devlin had mentioned how much the child support had been over the years. Caelan had told me. Devlin had given him the rough numbers. The numbers had added up, over 16 years of escalating payments to approximately $190,000. I had been quiet for a long moment. I had then asked Caelan whether he had any sense of how that money had been used. Caelan had been confused by the question. He had said, "Mom, I do not know. I always assumed it had been used for the regular things. Food, clothes, the small expenses of raising me. I never thought about it specifically. I had told him I would think about it." I had spent the following several weeks doing the small, careful research that had been required to figure out what had actually happened to the money. I had not been a forensic accountant. I had been, however, a senior construction project manager who had spent years tracking the flow of large sums of money through complex multi-party projects. I had known how to follow money. I had known what to look for. I had requested, through a small attorney I had retained, copies of the child support payment records from the Indiana Department of Child Services. The records had shown every payment Devlin had made over the 16 years. The records had shown that the payments had been deposited into a bank account at a regional bank, in my mother's name as legal guardian of Caelan. My attorney had then requested, through a small subpoena process that had been available in our state, the bank statements for that account over the same 16-year period. The bank had complied. The bank statements had been thorough. The bank statements had shown that the account had received approximately $190,000 in child support payments over the 16 years. The bank statements had also shown that the account had been almost entirely drained, on a continuous basis, through transfers to other accounts that had been in my parents' names. The transfers had been small, frequent, and consistent. The transfers had not been to accounts that had been earmarked for Caelan's benefit. The transfers had been to my parents' personal checking accounts, their personal savings accounts, and various small accounts that had been used to pay for things including a new car my mother had purchased in 2014, a small kitchen renovation my parents had completed in 2016, several vacations my parents had taken throughout the period, and various other small personal expenditures. The bank statements had also shown that the small balance that had remained in the guardianship account by the time Caelan had turned 18 had been approximately $2,200. I had done the math. I had calculated, conservatively, that of the approximately $190,000 Devlin had paid in child support, approximately $147,000 had been diverted to my parents' personal use, in a manner that had been clearly inconsistent with their legal obligations as Caelan's guardians, and that had been entirely outside the legitimate uses for which child support payments had been intended. I had retained a different attorney for the next part of the process. I had retained a small experienced civil litigator named Mr. Soren Korhonen, who had specialized in family financial disputes for the previous 26 years. Mr. Korhonen had reviewed the documentation. Mr. Korhonen had told me, in our first meeting, that I had a strong case for civil recovery against my parents on multiple theories, including breach of fiduciary duty as guardians, conversion of funds, and unjust enrichment. Mr. Korhonen had also told me that I had the option, if I wanted, to refer the matter to the county prosecutor's office for potential criminal charges. He had advised against that. He had explained that civil recovery would be faster, more controllable, and more likely to result in the actual return of the money. He had also explained that civil recovery would let me decide at each step of the process how aggressive I wanted to be. I had agreed to the civil recovery approach. We had spent the following 9 months building the case. We had filed the complaint in our county civil court 2 weeks before the morning in my mother's entryway. The complaint had been served formally by sheriff's deputies because the formal service had been important for establishing the timeline of the case. The formal service had also been, in the way Mr. Korhonen had carefully explained to me the small specific moment when my parents had been required to understand that the matter had become a legal proceeding rather than a family dispute. I want to tell you what had happened in the entryway, because the entryway had been the moment. My mother had been holding the folder I had handed her. Her hand had been trembling. Her mouth had been still open. My father had been still in the kitchen doorway. The deputies had been polite. The lead deputy, a woman in her 40s named Sergeant Sheridan, had introduced herself. She had asked my mother to confirm her identity. My mother had confirmed it. Sergeant Sheridan had asked my father to confirm his identity. My father had confirmed it. Sergeant Sheridan had explained that the documents I had handed my mother were a civil complaint and summons, and that the service had been completed by the act of physical handing of the documents to the named defendants. She had asked my mother and father if they had any questions. They had not had any questions. Sergeant Sheridan had then asked them to sign a small acknowledgement of service, which had been a standard form. They had both signed it. The deputies had then thanked us all for our cooperation. They had told my mother and father that they had 28 days to file a formal response through an attorney. They had told them they should consult with an attorney as soon as possible. They had then left the house. I had stood in the entryway with my parents. I had told them in the small, clear voice I had been preparing for 9 months, the words I had been needing to say for 16 years. I had said, "Mom, Dad, I want you to understand what has happened today. I have filed a lawsuit against you for the recovery of $147,000 in child support payments that you stole from me and Caelan over the previous 12 years. The lawsuit will be litigated in our county civil court. You will be required to retain an attorney and to respond to the complaint within 28 days. If you do not respond, a default judgment will be entered against you for the full amount. If you do respond, the litigation will proceed through the standard civil discovery process. The discovery process will include the deposition of both of you under oath. The discovery process will also include the production of every bank record relevant to the guardianship account. The records have already been obtained by my attorney. The records show what you did. The records are not in dispute. The litigation is not about whether you took the money. The litigation is about how much you will be required to repay and on what timeline. My mother had finally been able to speak. She had said, in a voice that had been 30 years older than the voice she had been using a few minutes earlier, "Say, please, this is family business. We can talk about this. We do not need lawyers. We do not need a lawsuit." I had told her in the same clear voice, "Mom, the time for family business was the 12 years you were taking the money. The time for family business was every Sunday afternoon I came to visit Caelan, and the two of you were spending his child support on a new car. The time for family business was every night I slept in my car at 19 years old while you were on vacation. The time for family to business was the 12 years. The 12 years are over. The lawsuit is now what is happening. The lawsuit is going to proceed. You can fight it, you can settle it, you can ignore it. The lawsuit will continue regardless of what you do." My father had not been able to look at me. He had been still in the kitchen doorway. He had been holding the small piece of toast. I had then turned and had walked out of the house. I had gotten into my car. I had driven home. I want to tell you what has happened in the 7 months since. My parents had hired an attorney. The attorney had been a small, careful older man who had specialized in family financial disputes from the defense side for the previous 30 years. The attorney had reviewed the documentation. The attorney had told my parents, in a small private meeting that I had heard about later through a cousin who had been close to my mother, that the case against them had been essentially indefensible on the underlying facts, and that the only realistic question had been whether to litigate the case to a likely loss or to negotiate a settlement. My parents had chosen to negotiate. The negotiations had taken about 4 months. The settlement had been reached in the 7th month. The settlement had required my parents to pay me $112,000 in cash within 60 days of the signing, with the remaining $35,000 to be paid through structured monthly payments of $1,500 over the following 2 years. The settlement had also required them to formally acknowledge in writing that they had improperly diverted child support funds from the guardianship account during the years in question. The acknowledgement had been important to me. The acknowledgement had been the small specific piece of the settlement that had been worth more to me than the money. My parents had been required to sell their house to make the initial payment. The house had been my childhood home. The selling had been hard for them. The selling had been the kind of consequence that had felt to me proportional to what they had done. They had moved into a small 2-bedroom apartment in the next town over. They had been working into their 70s to make the monthly payments on the remaining balance. I had not been in contact with my parents since the morning in the entryway. The negotiations had been conducted entirely through our respective attorneys. The settlement had been signed in 2 separate offices on the same day. We had not been in the same room. Caelan has been doing well. Caelan had been told about the lawsuit before I had filed it. Caelan had been supportive. Caelan had been processing, in his own way, the small, careful reframing of what his childhood had actually been. The reframing had been hard for him. Caelan had been working through it with a small, careful therapist who had been helping him understand that the grandparents he had been raised by had been the people who had been taking from him, not the people who had been giving to him. The understanding had been slow. The understanding had been necessary. Caelan was at our local community college now, studying to become an electrician like his father. Devlin had been mentoring him. Devlin had been the kind of father he had been for 19 years. Devlin and I had had several long conversations after the settlement had been reached. Devlin had been horrified. Devlin had not known any of the specifics. Devlin had been making child support payments in good faith for 16 years, assuming the payments had been used for Caelan. Devlin had felt guilty about not having figured it out sooner. I had told him not to feel guilty. I had told him he had been doing his part. I had told him the failure had not been his to detect. I had told him the failure had been my parents' to commit and mine to eventually uncover. Devlin had been quiet for a long time. He had then told me he had been proud of me. He had told me he was glad Caelan had been with me now. He had told me he had been wishing he had been able to do more for the two of us during the years I had been struggling. I had told him he had been doing what he had been able to do, and that what he had been doing had been the foundation of the rest of what had eventually happened. I want to tell you what I have learned, because the learning has been the foundation of everything I have been thinking about for the past several months. The first thing I have learned is that the most powerful lie a family can tell you is the lie that the money being held for you is being held for you. The lie is small. The lie is daily. The lie is the kind of lie that does not require anybody to explicitly state it. The lie operates through silence and assumption. The family member who has been holding the money simply continues to hold it. The family member who is supposed to be receiving the money simply continues to assume that the money is being applied to her benefit in ways she does not need to ask about. The lie can operate for decades. The lie operated in my family for 12 years. The lie operated because I had been 17 when the structure had been set up, and because I had not had the framework at 17 to question what the structure had been doing, and because by the time I had been old enough to question it, I had also been homeless and exhausted and unable to do the research that would have been required to uncover it. If you have a family member who has been holding money for you in some kind of guardianship or trustee capacity, please consider asking for an accounting. The asking is not an accusation. The asking is the small, specific protection you can give yourself. If the family member is doing what they are supposed to be doing, the accounting will confirm it. If the family member is not doing what they are supposed to be doing, the accounting will be the small piece of evidence that lets you begin to address the situation. Either way, the asking is the protection. Ask. The asking is your right. The second thing I have learned is that the formal legal systems exist for situations exactly like the one I had been in, and the using of the formal legal systems is not a betrayal of your family. My mother had told me, in the entryway and several times since through intermediaries, that I had betrayed the family by filing the lawsuit. The framing of my actions as a betrayal had been the predictable framing that families use when one member of the family finally decides to address a long-standing pattern of harm through formal channels. The framing had not been accurate. The accurate framing had been that I had used the legal system that exists in every American state specifically for the recovery of misappropriated guardianship funds. The legal system had been doing what the legal system had been designed to do. The legal system had not been brought into the family by me. The legal system had been brought into the family by the years of misappropriation that had occurred in violation of the system's standards. My filing of the lawsuit had been the small specific act of bringing the violation into the formal venue that already existed to address it. If you are weighing whether to use formal legal channels against a family member who has been harming you financially over a long period, please consider that the formal channels exist exactly for situations like yours, and that the using of them is not a moral failing on your part. The using is the using of a tool that was designed by people who anticipated that situations like yours would occur. The tool is there. The tool is available to you. The tool is what protects you from the depletion that would continue if you did not use it. Use the tool. The using is what the tool was made for. The third thing I have learned, and the last one I want to give to you, is that the children who were raised inside the family pattern that harmed you are sometimes the most important witnesses to what eventually has to be done about the pattern. My son Caelan had been raised inside the pattern. Caelan had been raised by my parents during the years I had been homeless. Caelan had been told a particular version of who I was and who my parents were and what the financial arrangements had been. Caelan had grown up inside the lie. When Caelan had been old enough to start observing the family for himself, in his teenage years, Caelan had begun to notice the small inconsistencies between the version he had been told and the version he had been seeing. Caelan had eventually been the one who had been at my kitchen table on a Saturday morning, telling me about the child support payments his father had been making that had triggered the small specific moment when I had finally decided to do the research that would lead to the lawsuit. Caelan had been the witness who had set it in motion. Caelan had not realized he had been a witness. Caelan had only realized, later, after the lawsuit had been filed and the settlement had been reached, that his small Saturday morning conversation had been the beginning of the unraveling of the family lie. If you have a child or a niece or a nephew or a younger family member who has been raised inside a family pattern that has been harming you, please consider that the child may eventually become the witness who lets you finally see the pattern clearly enough to do something about it. The child is not your responsibility to recruit. The child is the small, specific person who has been growing up inside the same family you have been growing up inside, and who is therefore in a unique position to eventually confirm what you have been suspecting. The confirming may come at a kitchen table on a Saturday morning. The confirming may come during a small conversation in a car. The confirming may come in a small, careful question the child asks that nobody else in the family had been willing to ask. Listen to the child. The child is the witness. The child is sometimes the only witness who is willing to tell you the truth. The truth is what you have been needing. The truth is what finally lets you do what has needed to be done. The doing of what has needed to be done is the inheritance you give the child in return for the witnessing. The inheritance is the foundation of the small different family the two of you can build together on the other side of the lie. Build it. The building is the work. The work is worth doing. I want to ask you something before you go. Tell me in the comments about a child in your life who eventually became the witness who let you see your family clearly. Tell me what they said. Tell me how old they were. Tell me what you did with what they told you. There are more of us than the families who built the lies we grew up inside would ever guess. We have been listening to the witnesses, slowly and carefully, for years. The listening has been the foundation of every honest action we have taken since. Tell me yours. I will be reading every single comment. I will see you in the next one.